well. You're
You're
muted.
Huh.
Sorry, I have a lot more mobility in my wrist. It's gaining strength.
Good.
My hip, on the other hand, is not doing as well as I'd like. I've kind of screwed
Oh.
up. I think I probably did too much. So now I'm really laying low. And
Sorry.
so, otherwise, I end up with a total hip, which I'm really trying to avoid here.
You are now live on YouTube and you're going live on CTN.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All
brother.
right, so we have everyone, and I saw that we have our a guest, Mr. Craig Allmiller. He's here too. So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to listen to our guest, and then we're going to talk a little bit about where we are with the review, the report that we're working on. So, oh, hi, how are you? Mary Kay. So, Mr. Allmiller, are you in the house?
I'm in the house, yes. I'm in the house.
How are you? I'm Linda
Schwartz.
Schwartz, and I'm the chairman. Do you know these other folks? Do you know Paul and Dr. Hauser?
I know Paul. I know.
Why don't we just go
Nancy.
around?
All right, let's do that. So, go ahead, you start, Nancy.
Okay, Nancy Allisberg. Great.
My name is Mike Lawler. I'm a professor at the University of New Haven.
Paul?
Paul, go ahead.
Paul Acker from Advocacy Unlimited.
And Dr. Hauser?
Hi, Lori Hauser. I'm a psychologist at Whiting.
So do you want to introduce our guest, Nancy, since you recruited him for this?
Well, I wouldn't say I recruited him. He asked whether he could speak with us. And he contacted me because we know each other. Craig is the former lead investigator at Disability Rights Connecticut. And he did the initial investigation, DRCT investigation into the abuse at Whiting, and prepared a draft report that was not the same report that we saw from DRCT. So he asked to speak with us because he thinks because he has information that he believes would be helpful to the task force as we're getting ready to finalize our report.
All right, well, thank you. Mr. Allmiller, will you please proceed with your presentation?
Sure. I have a little prepared statement, so I'll just go through that. And then I'll let you know when I'm done with that part, and then when I'm just talking. So I guess the first thing I wanted to, and I'm reading off a screen, so I apologize if I'm not making eye contact at one time. I don't know, there was a substantial difference between the report released by DRCT and the report that I was finalizing. I was finalizing it in the fall of 2018, or excuse me, the spring of 2019, and it ultimately came out in November of 2019. But I have no insight into why there is such a substantial difference. I submitted my work, which is the final thing I did as an employee there, and I don't know. The disconnect is unknown to me. In many ways, also, I'm not offering a critique of that report. I'm not trying to find fault with that report. That report is that report, and that was not the report I was working on, so I would prefer to just talk about my report and in the way it differs from the DRCT report.
Well, first of all, we want to thank you for coming. Taking the time to seek us out. And we're very interested to hear what you have to say. So
Thank you. I mean, and thank you for having me, because it's an opportunity for me to get out information that might not otherwise be known.
Understand,
So,
yes.
you know, I worked hard and want people to know about it. So.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so anyway, thank you. So in many ways, well, I should say in some ways, the report issued by DRCT and the report I was preparing do overlap in some specific areas. They're not labeled the same thing necessarily as I would have labeled them or as I was thinking of them. These are the findings, I would say in particular. But there were also areas that in the report that were considered findings that I thought of as issues. They were these as issues, the difference being a finding is something you're certain of, an issue obviously being something you're concerned about. So all of the issues that were in the DRCT report, the issues, I was aware of, but the big difference between my report and that one is in the findings. And so let me get to how, and also how those findings are made. For a little bit of background, and again, I'm not just, you know, my biography is of minimal interest, but it does reflect upon how I came to make the findings and methodology therein. So that's how it's relevant. I was hired at Disability Rights Connecticut in the fall of 2017. I worked there until the spring of 2019 as an investigator and then as a lead investigator. And during that time, there was special emphasis put on investigation Whiting, which would begun as a result of the news reports, you know, regarding Mr. Shahadi. Prior to working at Disability Rights Connecticut, I worked at Disability Rights Washington, which is the federal program in the state of Washington. That's the mirror of Disability Rights Connecticut. I worked there for 19 years. I worked on abuse and neglect investigations regarding individuals and groups of individuals, investigation involving circumstances of imminent jeopardy and harm, as well as neglect due to long-term conditions. I worked on several death investigations. I worked as the lead investigator on 3 complex and successful class action lawsuits in federal court. I provided testimony in each of these cases, primarily in the form of declarations to which materials supporting the claims in the case were made. So often there would be a declaration of Miller, and attached to that would be medical records and so on and so forth. All of which, though, I had reviewed and so could say, yes, I looked at them. Okay, so again, I provided testimony. I worked extensively with the expert witnesses in each of these cases, as well as more consultative issues on other cases. And then I monitored the state of Washington's compliance with the terms of the settlement in those 3 cases. So regarding every investigation I did, there was some form, whether in a report or in a declaration attached to a piece of litigation, some written document was prepared, you know, wrapping up what I'd found. And so as far as the report, these reports or declarations in support of litigation, and again, I was doing all of this under the supervision of an attorney. For litigation purposes, everything had to be reasonably calculated to meet either state or federal standards of evidence. there's no guarantee that you will, the court's the only one that decides evidence, but whatever I was gathering had to have a chance to meet that. So information that was conclusory, anecdotal, speculative, all those things that the standard of evidence is was ruled out and was not permitted. And this, even though not everything I did was as an investigator was with the end of litigation or litigation in mind, the standard of evidence used by courts is a good standard for evidence. I mean, that's what it is. And so that was the standard by which I used all information that I gathered, and how I gathered it, et cetera. Even if it was, say, at an investigation of abuse and neglect regarding one individual living in the community, the information gathered and how it was gathered and how the findings were made was the same as if you're going to court. It just gave me a way to work. And so the standard thus enables you to demonstrate and testify to, if needed, because sometimes your findings end up in court when you don't expect it. So you have to be ready for it. So everything you do, did, it was in preparation with the understanding that I and what I had written might end up in a court of law. And the purpose of all this was to draw a very direct, demonstrable line between how the evidence was gathered, what evidence was gathered, and what these findings were. So it should read seamlessly, as much as possible. The report should be seen without any, as much as possible, opinion, conclusion, anecdotal evidence. One of the things about that made a slight bit of difference, I'd say, in how I approach the Whiting investigation is that under the Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness Act, which is what authorizes PNAs to do their mental health work, that case law has concluded that if you initiate an investigation based upon your probable cause authority, that cannot be in turn used in litigation. There's a variety of complex reasons for that, and some not so complex, but because we, or again, Nancy in particular, invoked our probable cause authority, everything that I got was not going to end up in front of a court. I knew that. It would be, however, made public, and I would assume it would be of use, but there was a little flexibility in the standard because of that. You go into it knowing that I knew I wouldn't end up on the stand, but nevertheless, that's my standard, and that's what I'm going to aim at to get there. And again, one of the issues is if I did not meet that standard of evidence, to mention this, explain why, and acknowledge that you're departing from that sort of methodology. Okay, so again, this is all in the sense of this is my thinking, how I approach abuse and neglect investigations, and that thus informed my findings. So in the fall of 2017, Nancy and I, again, she's my direct supervisor, determined the scope and purpose and methodology of the investigation. The scope would be, and this is something I believe any good report should have, but the scope was we were going to only focus upon Whiting, nothing to do with Dutcher, nothing to do with CVH, only Whiting because that's where Mr. Shahadi was. And we would only investigate issues that had a direct, very direct upon the abuse of Mr. Shahadi. And also, I would say the immediate responses to that abuse, the issues around Mr. Shahadi. So it was, that was the scope. The purpose was to identify the structural long-term issues at Whiting that likely contributed to this abuse. The report would, again, its purpose was not necessarily to offer recommendations, or what recommendations were to be minimal, because any implementation of any recommendations would actually require further expert analysis that was not, this wasn't a roadmap for going forward. This was sort of a look back and how we got there, and going forward would take a lot more other thought. Likewise, there was no analysis, and there's a careful attempt, we succeeded in not addressing any of the criminal issues around Mr. Shahadi's case. The criminal investigation was ongoing. Nancy and I made great efforts to make sure that we did not cross that criminal investigation in any way, that we did not compromise it in any way. So I did not speak to any individual who was either as a witness or as an alleged participant in the abuse about that abuse itself. I never asked the question. I never spoke with any staff person who was under criminal investigation. So the purpose, again, was just, how did this happen? What structural issues, not the individual issues, not the incidents themselves, but what were the structural issues present that contributed to the event and the events? And again, the operative word there is contribute. It didn't cause, contributed. So I guess one of the largest differences, and I'm coming to the end of my prepared stuff, so would be found on page 11 of the DRCT report. If you have it, and if you don't, you don't need to, because I can describe it. Page 11 of the DRCT report explains their methodology and the scope and the purpose. But I would say that, and it also presents, I would say, an almost impressionistic description of the information that was gathered. I don't think page 11 presents a full picture of the information that was gathered. Again, I don't have, if whatever numbers, hard numbers, and the only one I can think of at the moment off the top of my head is the number 19. Beyond that number 19, I would be at a loss to give a hard number, but I can give rough, good estimates. Obviously, I'm not an employee of DRCT at the moment, so I don't have access to, all my work is at the property of DRCT, so it's not something for me to consult on, working off memory. So again, page 11 of the DRCT report, in my opinion, does not present a full picture of the evidence gathered. Um, Between myself and Ann Broadhurst, who is the other investigator at DRCT, and again, this was initially under the supervision of Nancy, and then we became under the supervision of Kathy Cushman, who became the new legal director after Nancy.
Oops. We lost you, Craig. Is anybody else having trouble hearing Craig? Yeah, Craig, we lost
Yes.
you.
Yeah,
No,
I can't hear him.
Yourself or in Teams.
There we go.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. We lost you for a second.
Okay.
But actually, I lost you myself before that. So if I just use clarification.
Sure.
And by the way, I'm Dr. Rodas. I'm sorry I missed the intro section here, but I'm the past president of St. Francis Hospital, and I'm an obstetrician by training.
Nice to meet you.
So you've talked about page 11, which we don't have in front of us, right? And you've said
I can send it to you.
Yeah, but it's okay, but because she said we don't need it. And you said there were substantial differences, and then you said something about number 19, but I wasn't sure
Yeah.
what number 19 is about. So maybe everybody else knows, and I'm just in the dark. But otherwise, could you please clarify what you're talking about?
Absolutely. I was just saying that that's the only number, the hard number that I recall off the top of my head about anything. Hard number. And there were 19 individuals who participated in the patient survey that is described briefly in the report. So that's the only number I have. Beyond that number of 19, I am relying upon my recollection. I don't have my own the documents in front of me because, again, those are the property of Disability Rights Connecticut, and I don't work there, and they're not mine. So I'm using, my recollection.
If I can just jump in real quick, because I think that number, we had asked specifically questions about the survey and the sample and how they gathered it, and they provided a response to us. If the rest of the members remember that, following their presentation, talked about the number of patients who were surveyed from the long-term units at Whiting, 19. They talked about how many patients they interviewed directly, 13. So they did provide some of those numbers afterward when we questioned the sample as well.
And you'll see when you get a copy of the report, what it says on page 19 is that they said 19 of the long-term patients chose to participate in a survey. There was some other language where they talked about records, and there wasn't a hard number for that. But the number 19 comes in the middle of page 11, and it says 19 long-term patients chose to participate in the survey. That's the hard number he's talking about.
And that's the only one I can recall.
Yeah.
And
like I said to the other task force members, we had gotten a little bit of additional information about the survey, the sample. When we inquired, they talked about how many patient records were reviewed from the different locations and the number of interviewees and the surveys and all that.
Okay. So between myself and Ann Broadhurst, I would say that over 100 visits were made to the facility for one reason or another. These visits purposely occurred across all shifts. Some of the visits were purposefully announced, and some visits were purposely not announced per our access authority, per the P&A's access authority. So I had ongoing meetings, regular scheduled meetings with both the leadership of CVH and Whiting Forensic Hospital. Monthly meetings.
Craig, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you just make sure I understand? When you said there were hundreds of visits, did that include, was that all interviewing the long-term patients, or was that interviewing other folks as well?
No, that was not I'd like to put the long-term patient survey aside for a second.
Oh, okay.
That was a very specific project with a very specific goal, which I'll explain.
Oh, okay.
The hundreds of visits were just, maybe I was there to talk to one of the quality assurance people, and on the way through, walking through the halls, a patient might approach me and say, "Can I talk to you?" And so, of course, yes, of course you can talk to me. Let's talk. And so there were, I would say, hundreds of these informal interactions, brief interviews, which I did not necessarily turn into a full-on interview where I was taking notes, because that gives kind of a false, I don't know, it turns it into instead of a natural interaction, it becomes a performance.
Mr. Mike, can I speak? I'm sorry. Mr. Rommler, just so again I'm clear, so now that I have, and thank you, Nancy, for sharing the report with us, that was great. So regarding page 11, you again said earlier that this is where a page that you thought there were substantial differences. So is the substantial difference between what your investigation found and what page 11 says is about what you just talked about, all those visits and interviews, that is not captured here? Or is there something else I'm missing about page 11 that is substantially different?
Page 11 leads to the findings, which I have not addressed yet. So page 11 is, to me, an essential page that, if what you've missed is anything beyond the methodology, that's true. It's not, all I'm talking about is methodology, but to me, that's largely everything. So I would say I had hundreds of interactions / interviews with patients. Sometimes I took notes, sometimes I didn't. I interviewed multiple, and again, I don't have the hard numbers because I don't recall them, they're not in front of me. I had, I would say, multiple interviews with family members and guardians.
We
Craig,
lost you
we
again.
lost
Craig,
you
we lost you
again.
again. We lost you after the words. You had a lot of
You know,
interviews with guardians. We lost you after that.
Pardon?
We lost
We
you
lost you
after
again.
something about the guardian, after meetings with the guardians. We lost you at that point.
Oh, okay. Okay. I conducted, I'd say, dozens of brief patient record reviews with patient consent. Not in depth. Those were not in depth. These would be usually the records, these records would be around some particular allegation of abuse and neglect, perhaps. And so I would maybe look at the face sheets, assessments, et cetera, and then the relevant records around the time, but it's not an in-depth analysis of these, dozens, I'd say. There were, however, in-depth analysis, and in fact, years worth of analysis regarding Mr. Shahadi, come back, Mr. Shahadi, Mr. Vermiglio, and the other patients who are identified with initials at the end of the DRCT report. My notes are departing from me. It's annoying. Anyway, so I'll try to, so I'll go on without the, oh, there they are. I attended I attended several PSRB hearings. That I had ongoing regular interviews and meetings with the patient advocates at CVH and Whiting, who were responsible for conducting the investigations. And I had ongoing interaction with the staff of CLRP, as well as a special public defender at Whiting. And now to the 19 individuals. Maybe you have this information, so that's very good. But just call it a survey is true, but doesn't give the full flavor of it, in the sense that these surveys were conducted in person, in private, always between Anne and myself, recorded as verbatim as possible. And the questions were all based upon SAMHSA trauma-informed care standards. So, for example, I recall the first question was, do you feel safe? And leave it open-ended, we have a conversation about these and several other questions. The participation was voluntary. The staff all knew we were doing it because it was announced at patient unit meetings saying, on Thursday, these people are going to come and be available to talk to you, or if you want to schedule a time, etc. Most of these were all scheduled. And I'd say on average, they lasted an hour. Sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. And the purpose was not to produce statistically valid findings out of that 19. That wasn't the idea. The idea was to somehow include in the report a sense of what it was to be a patient living in Whiting in regard to the abuse and neglect issues. Just a vibe. So I would say, before I get to the findings, I would say that throughout I adhered to what I believe and understand and assumed I was working under federal rules of evidence, except for in two circumstances. The two circumstances being, in regard to the finding about the abuse and neglect investigation, reporting, response system at Whiting Forensic Hospital, I used myself and Anne as experts. Now that would never be allowed in court. An investigator can't opine on, say, oh, I'm so great. That's not allowed. But I felt that between Anne and myself, and further consultation with Nancy, that we could act in that capacity as an expert witness and be able to say with professional credibility that this is the standard, this is the right way to do it, this is the wrong way to do it. And so there's some actual opinion and conclusions found that would normally be considered from expert testimony, but I treated myself as an expert arrogantly in that there. Again, and then finally, as I said, the 19 formal in-depth interviews, information gathered from that was acknowledged as being anecdotal. They were to be used as exemplars, to create, because when you're doing an investigation, you also want to get the tenor of investigation like this that spoke to this pervasive, almost ritualized abuse. I wanted to be able to understand the temperature in the room, the culture of the facility that would contribute to that. So again, and we excerpted, I found some of the excerpts very helpful. And to the extent that there was any sort of data analysis, it's modest, would be recurring themes that patients talked about. If everybody was talking about something, then that was of interest. If no one was interested in talking to me about that, then obviously that wasn't a concern. So in that sense, it was sort of, some, data was gathered, I guess. But again, it was anecdotal.
Craig, can I just ask a question? This is
Sure, I'm ready. I'm prepared stuff.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt. You can keep going after this, but on the supplemental information that we got from DRCT, it says we asked them how many patient records were reviewed, and they said that there were 7 records of 7 patients were reviewed by DRCT investigators. Was that something that occurred while you were there, and were there only 7 records reviewed? Well, that you're aware of?
It's hard for me to comment on the numbers. I don't know where they got that number.
How many records do you recall reviewing?
It would be in the dozen. It would be, I looked at dozens of patient records.
Okay.
My guess, my recollection. Maybe the smaller number is speaking to those which bore relevance to the investigation, because of course you look at things that turn out to be not relevant. So I am, in my number, I guess I am including, perhaps, and this is speculation, perhaps I may be including in my recollection of dozens of incidents, I may have looked at a patient medical record and found nothing of interest, not of interest, but nothing that bore directly upon the investigation I was doing. Because of course, as anybody knows, that as we all know, that if an investigator is on the unit, it's an unusual event and people want to talk to that person, and people understandably looking for an advocate will attempt to say, oh yeah, that's in my record, take a look. And so I always did, and it wasn't always there, which as far as what I was doing. And because there was it was hard, it was difficult. Sometimes it was difficult to communicate both to staff and patients the difference between an advocate and investigator. I'm not there arguing on behalf of any patient. I'm not advancing a patient's wishes. I am investigating. It's different. Also, I left off the regular attendance at the patient rights meeting? I can't remember. Yes, that too.
So Mr. Allmiller,
John has
you really piqued our interest, and I'm sitting here at the edge of my chair wanting to know what you found.
Okay. Based on all that, Anne and I identified 3 major areas of concern. The first, and again, bearing on, and these were not, let me rephrase that, not areas of concern, but something that we could validate in one way or another, a kind of what we suspected was a deficiency. The first being that the abuse and neglect reporting and response mechanism was inadequate to the point of being actually detrimental to the patients. I wouldn't want to use it if I had been a patient, because information that was provided to investigators, quote unquote investigators, would sometimes appear in your treatment plan, or out of the mouth of your psychologist or out of the mouth of your psychiatrist. I can't begin to explain all the ways in which that violates an investigation. but it does. And also the same person who would be your advocate would then investigate you. And so who is this person? Do I trust you? Do I not trust you? What are you? And then they had nothing that I could identify as anything. Their system for investigating abuse and neglect was ad hoc. It was impressionistic. It feels like this. I got a good idea about this. And for example, I interviewed, I can't imagine how many times I talked to him. I'm sure he regrets it in retrospect, because I was playing the Columbo thing. I was going, oh, tell me about it. I don't know. What do you mean? And, he would talk about, I would present a scenario to him, or an incident would come up that I would know about and he would know about. And he'd say, well, I really think what's going on here is XYZ. And then sure enough, his report says XYZ. That's not an investigation. It's something, but it's not an investigation. These are anecdotes from that. But I would say it had no standard. There were no standard methodologies for how an investigation was conducted, and there were no standard methodologies for what evidence was gathered. There was no standard methodology for anything. So you couldn't, in regard to Mr. Shahadi, he made, as we know, multiple allegations of abuse and neglect. It was commonly assumed that most of these were false, because much of what Mr. Shahadi said might, in the opinion of others, be fabricated. My approach is different in that you're not, patients who are complaining about abuse and neglect are not crying wolf. They might not be talking directly about abuse and neglect, but they're not crying wolf. And you can't write people off. I mean, it's certainly you can take into account that the person has a tendency to make false allegations. That's certainly something that would fit into a patient's constellation of symptoms, but it can't become totally actionable ever. Because, for example, as an investigator, I might get something, a report from a fired, disgruntled employee who has an axe to grind. That axe doesn't have anything to do with the facts necessarily. That person, it might even be, a bad reporter, but the investigation reveals something. So you have to be very, very, very judicious in how you go about this. And again, there was this there were multiple issues that again, the abuse and neglect investigation team because I don't want to get into clinical judgment. As a investigator, I would be very uncomfortable if, for example, as I saw on more than one occasion, a treatment goal was to reduce contacting the abuse and neglect investigators. Stop making false accusations was sometimes a treatment goal. I wouldn't have been comfortable with that as an investigator. The
So you're
clinician made,
suggesting that this was actually in the treatment plan or on the orders?
of course it was. It was in the treatment plan. It would be a treatment
Okay.
goal. And I'm sure there was some legitimacy on the part of the clinician going at it. I don't think it was like to repress, repress information necessarily. I think it was done with goodwill, but it was, again, there was such an absence of an understanding of what an investigation is and does and what it's about and how it goes about it in the facility as a whole, that sort of thing crept into treatment plans. It did. And to me, I'm avoiding any sort of clinical judgment. I'm just saying, as an investigator, I would feel just very uncomfortable operating in that environment. So I'll start with that. One is the area involving the methodology and practice of the abuse and neglect investigations, including how they're reported, investigated, and followed up. The second major area of concern that I found and that I felt bore directly upon Mr. Shahadi, who I believe, and I could be wrong, at the time of the abuse that occurred, I don't believe he was on any active psychoactive medication. I think he was, certainly he had a diagnosis at times of autism. It seemed as clearly, however, whatever you think about where this is coming from, he had a behavior disorder. He would do things that upset everybody. They would have upset me. They upset the other patients on the unit. And he seemed to have little control over these behaviors. He seemed impulsive. And it seemed as though no amount of negative stimulus or consequence was going to result in, what's usually used as the word insight into, if you do this, this bad thing will happen to you. So you learn not to do those things. There was some information processing that he was struggling with, whether this was due to what would be an autism spectrum disorder or intellectual developmental disability, or I don't know what, but he was clearly having processing issues that were resulting in this continued conduct that was so
Craig, you froze again. You froze this time and we can't hear you. Can you hear me?
I know, I realize, I forgot.
Yeah.
Craig,
Let me try to text him.
Craig, you froze.
You froze for a minute
okay.
there. So we lost you after.
Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now. You're back now. But since I have you back, can I ask a question? So this is your second finding. I'm not sure so I understand. What's the finding exactly that you're alluding to?
Exactly, is that there was any kind of programming at Whiting that was designed for individuals with extreme conduct disorders arising out of some information processing difficulty, such as an individual with a developmental disability and a conduct disorder of some kind. There was no accounting for that. It was a cookie cutter, positive, negative reinforcement, and there was no programming, and they had none, and they said they had none, that were specialized for individuals with a dual diagnosis. The treatment planning and administration was for people with long-term mental illnesses that would respond to psychiatric medication largely. That's what they did. that's what they tell you they did. One of the people who told me that that's what was done was, I don't recall his name, but he was the chief medical officer for Demas. There was a young woman who was on CVH. She was not a forensic patient. She was behaving in very destructive behavior, self-injurious behavior, and behavior to others. She was in jeopardy. She was going regularly to the emergency room, usually because she's ingested a foreign object. And she had, as happens, she had been caught in this, she was in this cycle of going to the emergency room, coming back, having some sort of outburst, then injuring herself again, or saying that she did, and going back to the emergency room, and on and on. The decision for treatment for her was put her in Whiting, because, and again, this was stated in a public meeting, and I don't recall the man's name, the medical director, that Whiting was appropriate for this woman because they were more experienced at Whiting with the application of seclusion and restraint. And so this woman, and so I'm going again, the failure of any sort of programming regarding individuals with, let's say, we used to say dual diagnosis of an intellectual disability and a mental health disorder. This young woman was then transferred to, because she was a female, the only females at Whiting were on the competency units. And so this female was transferred to Whiting because in the statements made by Demas medical director, Whiting was more skilled at the application of seclusion and restraint. Whiting was also better at monitoring contraband. And that was why she was there. I don't know if you know, but an individual such as this often engages in mimicking behavior in order to get attention. So to put someone with an intellectual developmental disability, which she had, on an award where individuals are displaying very acute psychiatric symptoms is not advisable.
Hey, can I ask a question? Just, I think you might have clarified this a second ago, but I just want to make sure I understand this. You've made reference to dual diagnosis, but when you're using that, you're basically saying the duality of a mental illness and a developmental disability, right? Those two things together. That's what you're referring to. And so my question is, do you or does anyone have any sense of the prevalence of this particular cohort at Whiting? I mean, is this, are there just maybe one or two, or is this something that's more, it's a more substantial group of people at Whiting?
Well, for one thing, we don't know, because there isn't regular testing done and it's not integrated into, so we don't know. I don't know.
So is a developmental disability something that's subject to ongoing testing, or is it you're either in one category or the other?
Let me answer your question. We don't know. I can't answer that question. Are you talking about people who have it identified on their treatment plan?
I'm asking you about the term that you're using.
I'm using the term dual diagnosis means intellectual developmental disability with some sort of mental illness, or what's usually labeled as a mental illness that manifests itself in some sort of conduct that presents difficulties.
So how prevalent is that at Whiting?
I don't know.
Maybe, can Lori help us on this? Lori, since you work there, you might know the answer to these questions.
I don't know if I can provide you a statistic, but I mean, I can explain at least that sometimes people come in with ample evidence, like from early testing that showed they've been, diagnosed with a developmental disability or intellectual disability. And so they may carry the diagnosis on that basis. If they don't, then they are tested at Whiting, and that may be the basis for it. Obviously, a lot of times for developmental diagnosis has to be before age 18. But nonetheless, so there are either someone comes in with it, or they can be tested and are tested within the hospital and carry that diagnosis, or we can refer out. We do have consultants that we work with around, particularly around autism spectrum diagnosis and things like that. But to answer the question of like how many people carry that diagnosis, constellation diagnosis, that would have to be something that DEMAS provides. But it's more than one or two. I would at least say that. I mean,
It's a continuing cohort.
All right,
Thank you.
Nancy has a
Thank you, Laura.
question, and then I'm going to jump in after her. Go ahead, Nancy.
Okay, my comment would be, with all due respect to Lori, that you're also going to see a lot of folks who may not carry the diagnosis, that if they've had a history of some sort of, whether it's a behavioral disruption, or whether it's something that is a DSM diagnosis, that is in fact an intellectual or developmental disability, they may not have been diagnosed with that before the age of 18. So, I mean, I know I've certainly seen lots of people who probably should have gotten a DD diagnosis, but for whatever reason were not tested before the age of 18. And as we all know, DDS is not going to consider them to have an intellectual or developmental disability if they weren't tested before the age of 18. And there's also a lot of misdiagnosis. There could be somebody who had a developmental disability, but because of whatever the frustrations or because of whatever their particular behavior is, were misdiagnosed as somebody with a mental health label. So what I'm suggesting, and I'm not sure if this is what Craig, if this is what you're talking about, but people who have the comorbidity may not necessarily have an official diagnosis of IDDD, but through your experience and your interviews with them, you are able to think that it's certainly possible that this might be someone with a comorbidity. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So my question.
And also one.
Okay. Can
he finish his answer first, Linda?
Well, I have another one that will dovetail with this. Okay. I want to ask Dr. Hauser. I had the luxury of being doing my practicum on MU10 at Yale, where people came in and 10 days of testing and everything else they did, they would come up with an actual diagnosis. And I'm wondering, it was a complete look at the physiological, the developmental, where were they as far as an intellectual? So I'm asking, is that part of the service that is available at CVH?
Yes, I mean, I can speak as a psychologist that is what psychologists do, particularly on the admission units. When folks come in for competency restoration, there's a lot of assessment that happens for folks that are in the long-term, that move on to the long-term units or PSRB. They may be retested at points along their treatment. Sometimes there's not a need for ongoing to test somebody every 2 years, but sometimes there raises a new question. If there's a referral question that can be answered through psychological testing, then the person gets referred and they're tested. So yes, there are mechanisms for that.
So let me ask you this. Let's just take the case that Mr. Miller just talked about, someone who was swallowing things and really hurting themselves. Would that be a cause to have more testing or some more, a more in-depth look at what was going on with that patient? I mean, it does seem like sending them over to CVH, over to Whiting is convenient, but is it a therapeutic approach to the issue?
Well, I think maybe two different questions there. I mean, one is it therapeutically necessary, and the other is there an assessment necessary? So as I said, if there's a referral question that is raised that can be answered through psychological testing, then that is when a psychologist would do testing, right? I'm not opining on whether, and I certainly can't speak about some of the cases that Mr. Ottmiller is referring to due to my position. So, but certainly somebody wouldn't need to be necessarily moved to a particular location simply to have testing.
No, what I'm saying is, if that particular patient had been afforded an opportunity for somebody to look, or sometimes some of the medications they're on can cause them to move. And so, and also age and other physiological issues that are going on. So my question is, and I'm not saying that this should be like, a rote that every 2 years we do this, but what kind of approach was used to find out what was really going on with this patient?
I can't speak to that.
Okay, but
I can tell you if there is, I can speak generally to say that if there is something going on with an individual that is perplexing others and that is interfering with their ability to live independently, to move out of the hospital, to be safe, to keep others safe, then yes, that particular issue is put under a microscope, and whether that involves psychological testing, behavioral consultation, a medication wash and review, trying different treatment approaches like that, those things happen all the time.
Craig, can you finish answering your question?
Yeah,
What you were trying to say?
I've gone off on something else. One of the consultants that Dr. Hauser mentioned was Dr. Gallegos, Rafael Gallegos, whose Demas is used regularly as an expert. And I'm saying what he's saying. This was a matter in which he was not retained to provide expert testimony, but he was retained to provide expert consultation, even though I'm familiar with these ideas and issues. I wanted a professional involved, and he was the professional involved. And I think it's significant that he isn't someone I found under a bush somewhere. He was Demas's own guy.
And this was something that he saw was the comorbidity. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's been like for years. Years.
And Craig, is it fair? Is what you're saying? I mean, Lori's saying if they see something, they'll test and to try to get an answer. Was it your observation that there wasn't a recognition by Demas of these comorbidities and that you weren't seeing Demas approach the patients with sort of this, let's leave no stone unturned and look into, is this one of the issues?
Well, I don't know if it was Demas or who, but I would say, for example, one individual who I know, Demas was unaware that he was actually a client of DDS. He had been a client of DDS, and he was at Whiting, and they lost track of him. They didn't know. He had been diagnosed within the age of 18. Nobody knew that he was DDS.
Dr. Rodas has a question.
Actually, go over comment, Linda. I want to be very sensitive to the time we have today. We only have until 3. I want to make sure we get to hear the third finding, so that we all have time then to ask questions. So but again, it's up to obviously chair's prerogative.
So, duly noted. Duly noted.
I want to finish with this individual because I think it's quite telling. The individual, however, had a diagnosis. This is the individual who was not known to DDS, who was at Whiting. This individual was known to have some sort of intellectual processing difficulties. However, in his treatment plan, the reasons why he was having trouble following instructions was something that the physician called micropsychosis. I am not familiar with micropsychosis. that somehow this individual was not psychotic and then was like psychotic for a micro, whatever micro is, and then got better. But in between there, when the instruction was being given, he was psychotic. And I spoke with the doctor about this, not in the sense of I'm advocating for this fellow, but I'm unfamiliar with this diagnosis of micropsychosis. To me, as a layman, it sounds like he's having information processing difficulties. Again, that's anecdotal, but I do think it speaks to the level of inattention to these issues at Whiting. I'm not saying.
Well, I want to be clear now. I want to be clear because you're kind of drifted into a clinical diagnosis realm, and I'm a little sensitive as a physician.
Well, I'm saying
if I understand micropsychosis, it's brief episodes of psychotic behavior under some stressful situation. It's a real thing, I think. At least that's my understanding. But I don't think you're by your background and training, are you in a position to? And I respectfully, I'm asking this question. Are you in a position to comment on the diagnosis that a trained psychiatrist, psychologist have made regarding a patient based on your assessment?
I'm able to meaningfully participate in a dialogue about it. Okay, let's go to the third area. The third area was.
Third area.
Pardon? The third finding. This is like I can say this without, finding would be what I would say was the effect of the Psychiatric Security Review Board is profound upon every aspect of patients' lives, to the extent that, and many patients, for example, and these are again among the
Mr. Allmiller, we can't hear you. Can you hear us? Mr. Allmiller, we haven't been able to hear you. Can you hear us?
He doesn't know how to follow rules.
Well, we're going to have to go back.
We missed you.
Okay. We missed you. Froze again. You must get out of the zone or something. And you were talking about the PSRB, the effects of the PSRB.
Right. The patients would say that the reason Shahad was the object of abuse was because people hated him because he could not follow the rules like what the PSRB wanted you to do. That was Mr. Shahadi's problem. And patients would talk about how that what was in the treatment plan did not make that much difference. What mattered to them was doing what the PSRB said. So if Demas or anybody else has the idea that somehow the PSRB is having a positive and direct influence on treatment planning and treatment provision, I'd watch it, because it's having what I would say is the opposite effect of saying, whatever with my treatment plan, it's the PSRB that counts. Whatever with my treatment, my doctor, what counts is the PSRB.
Laura, you're going to have to help me again here. I didn't think the PSRB actually made rules for patients, but so am I wrong on this? And we have our own questions and so on, Miller, about PSRB. So
they make rules for movement. So if you're going to go from Whiting to Dutcher,
I understand that, but
yeah,
I don't think that's what Mr. Rommel was talking about, was he?
Well, yes, it was, because in order to be considered for transfer to Dutcher, or in order to be considered for movement out, that is all largely according to the patient's minds to what the criteria are for movement by the PSRB. You can do whatever you want with your treatment goals, but if you want to get out of Whiting, you pay attention to what the PSRB says. So in that sense, they have undermined the professional judgment of, because I've had more than one occasion where the treating professionals would say, this person is ready for transfer to Dutcher. There's nothing more we can do. And the PSRB would say, no, not going anywhere. When clearly that transfer would have been therapeutically indicated. So this is not only a departure from professional judgment, this is no professional judgment is even being allowed to be exerted, brought to bear. So yeah, the PSRB handles patient movements. Patient movement is directly involved in patient behavior, involved in patient treatment planning. And the other thing that I would say that contributes to this is that's where.
Wait a minute, Dr. Hauser.
I want to make sure I understood that correctly. You said that that professional there wasn't even a place for professional judgment to even like be expressed.
Oh, it could be expressed. It just wasn't done. Nothing was done about it. The treatment team, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, everybody says, you don't belong in Whiting anymore. It would be the best thing for you in our collective judgment to be in a less restrictive atmosphere such as Dutcher. They go and present at the PSRB hearing as if they are pleading a case, frankly. It feels like a courtroom for both patients and staff.
Well, it is an adversarial process.
Yes, it is an adversarial process, but why is that adversarial process? They win. The PSRB wins because the treatment team said this individual should move to Dutcher. The PSRB said no. We don't like. We're not impressed.
And this is a point that we've actually discussed a lot among the task force, and actually a lot of the other members, all the other members were in agreement about eliminating that the intervention of the PSRB for the internal movement, and I actually disagreed. But at the end of the day, the PSRB is the trier of fact in this. So there is still two sides being presented. The hospital presents what they believe when they believe somebody's ready to transfer, whether it's from Whiting to Dutcher or from Dutcher out into the community. And then there's a place for both sides to be heard, with the PSRB being the arbiter of that.
So it's not really the two sides being heard. The PSRB is the judge of its own actions.
Okay, we have people wanting to speak. Dr. Rodas and Paul.
No, I think actually Lori captured what I was going to. Lori was going to capture what I was going to say, which was that we, Craig, right. we amongst ourselves have had a fair amount of discussion about the role of the PSRB, specifically about moving patients within, not outside, but at least within. To your point, from Whiting to Dutcher, do they really need to be in that part? And we've had a lively discussion about that. So this issue has come up for us already. So just to let you know, we've
right,
I'm not
Paul?
saying whether we have a consensus yet, but we've certainly discussed it.
Right. And even around the issue of should they be there in the first place? Because I think, a lot of what happens with the PSRB is decisions get made that are political and not treatment. It's kind of interesting because, to your first point about the investigations, I mean, we even heard from Dr. Wasser himself say, well, they can't be believed because of their diagnosis before he was corrected in the meeting. And so I think that's a very salient point to bring forward, that whatever investigative body we have look into this needs to be independent, needs to take each investigation seriously, even if it's the 500th time that the person's being investigated, and that there are established procedures. Like you said, it can't be ad hoc. One of the questions that I have was, I was at a meeting earlier where someone who actually works at Whiting, we were talking about, systems change and stuff. And the person basically alluded to the fact that there's strong opinions about law and order with the staff at Whiting. And I'm wondering how that, do you think that something like that would come into play? Because in a way, I kind of feel like that, you know, the adage of, oh my God, they're getting away with it because they're you know, they were found not guilty by reason of insanity, that somehow, you know, the staff may have that, like, oh my God, they're getting away with it, so therefore we have to hold them longer. Or and even when you were talking about the treatment, in the DRCT report, they talked about the level system and that there really wasn't individualized treatment. Can you go a little further on that?
About the level system in particular?
The individualized treatment plans.
In individualized treatment, because it seems to dovetail with the person that you were talking about, how there wasn't anything individualized. You know, it's
right.
Boilerplate treatment plans.
Well, I can't say that. I can't say that in the sense of that there's no such thing as an average patient, obviously, but for those individuals who were there subsequent to a forensic finding and mental illness alone, I don't know if those are boilerplate or not. I didn't dive that deeply partly because Mr. Shahadi was not that person. He was not your average patient. He was the exception that challenged the place. And so the question was how does the place respond to the challenge? I mean, it's difficult. How when the difficult person comes in, do you respond to that challenge? So that's what led me down this path, was that knowing he was not, you know, your average patient. So although I looked at, as I said, dozens of other patient records, I can't comment. I just don't know. I didn't go deep enough, and I didn't consult any outside experts about that. For medication, for example. You know, does everybody on the ward get the same medication all the time? I never looked at anything like that.
I feel compelled as the chair to remind everybody we're coming to the end of our time. And so, Mr. Miller, if you have some more points, we are, you know, coming into the zone, as we like to say, of where we'll have to be. Could you just?
Can I just ask one sort of very overarching question here? In your opinion, Dr. O'Miller,
I'm not a doctor.
Whatever things the things you brought to our attention, which of these things were not in the initial report?
In the DRCT report?
Yeah.
I think they're all in there one way or another, that they're not articulated.
Right. So you're adding a little context, background. Yeah, got it.
Yes, yes. I think, I mean, the DRCT report has, I think, maybe 10 or 11 findings. I think, I can't remember just now. I think that my findings were 3, and I think among those 11, there are some overlap with those 3.
Got it. Okay.
Does that explain?
Yeah. I didn't know if we were missing something that had been completely left out that you were trying to bring to our attention.
No, it's in there, but it's not articulated the way I've articulated it.
Got it.
And the connection to the methodology with which the information was gathered was not articulated in the report.
Are there any more questions for Mr. Miller? Any final thoughts, Mr. Miller, for us?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was I learned that you were wrapping up your work, and so I was very eager to hope to have this opportunity, and thank you.
Well, thank you for coming. I think you've stirred up some thoughts. And some discussion. We
Sure.
appreciate you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
We're gonna go on. We have to go on to another part of our meeting.
I don't know how I leave.
You have a video thing there? You have to hit it.
No, there's a thing that says leave meeting. There
Oh,
you go.
okay, he's gone. Okay. All right, so I do think one thing that I gleaned from this was the fact that the PSRB making those clinical decisions does in a way discredit sometimes the clinical decisions that are being presented. It puts them on a bad, it's the trust that you need in a therapeutic alliance can be damaged by a clinician saying they're ready and somebody else saying, no, they're not. And so I think yes, Dr. Otis?
So we've said that before, and we
Yes.
identified that, but if I remember right, and guys, correct me if I'm wrong, the agreement between the clinicians and the PSRB was far greater than the disagreement. Do I have that wrong? I thought it was greater than 90% of the time. The PSRB said, yes,
90.
clinicians felt you should move from.
Right. And so at 93% of the time, why have the PSRB there?
No, I'm not disagreeing
Is
with
the
that.
question,
I'm not disagreeing with that, Paul, because we were
Right.
talking about that. But I just want to, it didn't, the way he made it sound like it's like, that the clinician's input was worthless and the PSRB just did whatever they wanted.
Right.
And
I think what he
with
means,
93% agreement, it sounds like they agree with the clinicians. That's all.
but I think what he means by worthless is that it still doesn't matter what the clinician says, because if the PSRB doesn't agree, that's what goes. And I think the point about the clinical alliance between the patient and the clinician, when the patient knows that the clinical determination is not what counts. And anyway, but we have agreed, with the exception of Lori, the rest of us have all agreed that that's got to change.
Okay. I would just like to use, we only have very few minutes. I would just like to say that Lori and I have been working on a report, but it is not an easy lift. And there are some topics I think some folks had said they might kick in with, helping with this. Nancy, would you be willing to do the abuse, the last question there, to look at it? What we have done, by the way.
We have done that, and Kim sent you what we did.
Yeah.
That's done.
When was that done?
Well, it was
well over a week ago.
Yeah, Kim sent it to you.
I don't have it. I didn't get it. Did you get it? No.
I think she sent it to Beverly.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll check on that, because what we have done, the way in which we've.
I did not receive anything, Linda.
Oh, Beverly
Really?
didn't.
Nope, I didn't. I would have sent it to Lori and Linda.
All right, I'll send it to everybody again. I've got the email right here.
Okay, great. So what we have done is we're doing the questions like we have as our framework, but we decided to put some of the first part of the discussion of each one as a finding, the things that we found, issues that spurred our thinking and support our recommendations. And you'll all be getting this, but it's really, I think I've spent over 20 hours working on it. What do you think, Lori? So we will, we are not done.
Good thing you're not getting paid by the hour,
Yes, and it's a good thing you don't have to do the typing. So it flows pretty well. We're not ready. It's not ready for prime time, but that's how we're doing it. And hopefully, and we're integrating some of the things that we did, like who we talked to and stuff like that, and how we arrived at these. I think we have 16 or 20 pages by now, but we'll be looking for your stuff, Nancy, and see. And hopefully at our next meeting, we can put a draft, but we're still, I know that Beverly has arranged for a debriefing of the study. from the Yukon study. Now, we have a draft of the results, but I'm wanting to hear from the group because we don't have an explanation. Sarah will be coming to go through the whole study with us. That was what, June 18th, or what was that, June 13th?
The 18th.
18th. Okay.
I'm sorry, when did we get the results?
The result was released yesterday or the day before. I did not send it because Mike had asked me to send it out, but because we were not discussing it today, I held on to it, and then I will send it out after the meeting.
Yeah, just
Right.
I can clarify on the
Okay.
process. Sarah Wakai from Yukon forwarded to me the draft basically, and I in turn sent it to Beverly. I pointed out that because it's a draft, you know, it's not publicly releasable at this point, Beverly, have you sent it to people yet, or the members of the task force?
No.
Okay,
I am
well,
waiting for you to have this discussion, Mike,
Yes,
and then I will
okay.
send it out so people will realize that it's not a public document as yet.
Yeah. So, and Sarah is, you know, they're going to add like an introduction and make a few adjustments and stuff like that. But it's the data is all there, and nothing shocking. It's, in my view, consistent with the kinds of things we've been hearing.
Right.
So my guess is that on the 18th, they will have totally finalized it, provided it to all of us. At that point, I suppose it will be a public document. And then she has volunteered to come and basically brief us, answer any questions, et cetera, on the 18th. And I think she and one of her colleagues is going to be missing in action over the next couple of weeks. So she said the final draft will probably be coming in a more like a couple of weeks from now, but you'll have all the guts of it anyways. Okay.
All right. So we how do you want to proceed? Because a lot of this is writing. I don't think we have a lot of well, we really do need time to actually.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure. What?
And Linda, you tell me if kind of where you're at with things, but if like we had talked about possibly getting the report pulled together into a draft form by next week so that we could share with the rest of the task.
I can't do it next week, but how about next week is
not to meet next week, but just to
okay.
give the document next week so that then we could meet weeks from now to discuss.
That would be great. That would be great.
Is that
I hate to
doable,
say,
Linda?
guys, I've been in
If we
3,
can,
so you know.
Yeah.
You're talking about the Memorial Day weekend? The 20, are you talking about the 28th?
Yeah, not meeting that date, but circulating the draft to the rest of the committee by then.
I'm going to ask for maybe the week after. I mean, because Memorial Day is like really jam-packed for me. And, but I was thinking like the 1st or 2nd of June.
I think the most important thing is if you get something to us, even 48 hours before Friday, 2 weeks from now, so that we all have a chance to look it over. I mean, we could read 20, 30, 40 pages, whatever it is, in a couple of days. So I don't think Lori was, you know, if it had to be Friday, right? Her point was to give us a week. But if you give us, I'm thinking, I don't want to speak for the group, but I think if you give us 2 days, it would be helpful. Otherwise, that meeting is, what are we going to meet about in 2 weeks?
Right.
Right.
So why don't we aim for that? Why don't we aim to have it circulated by the 1st? On the 3rd, is that am I thinking the days correctly?
I'm actually
Right, the 2nd, the 4th.
the 2nd of June because I'm teaching
2nd, yeah.
Wait, the 2nd of
June.
Yeah, that's.
we have a meeting on June 4th, not June
Correct.
2nd.
I'm saying
Right.
to circulate the
Nothing
draft
was
by June
scheduled
2nd.
for the 4th, Nancy. We don't have
Okay.
anything scheduled for the 4th. Today would be that decision since you guys are working on the report. And,
Oh.
based on what Linda said earlier, that it's a heavy lift. I don't know if you want to meet in 2 weeks again and the report, the draft is not ready. So that's a decision that Linda and Laura will have to make.
Well, you definitely want to meet on the 4th of June.
Only if draft is ready by then. I think we can do it, but that's up to you, Linda.
As I said, I'm back in teaching, and it's wonderful to do it with Zoom. So, but I have 3 full days of teaching between now and what about the 11th?
To,
So we'll meet 2 weeks in a row.
I can't meet on the 11th. I mean, we had planned on every other week, so I have that blocked off.
Well, there are some things that happen in life that cannot be
So
and that has happened with my husband coming home from the hospital. Sorry.
should we maybe plan then just to meet on the 18th? We'll hear from Sarah and the results of the study, and we can also plan to circulate the draft
Before then?
within the week before that,
Definitely before
that we
then
can
it
at least
can be done. Yes.
start to talk about that process. Because then as soon as we hear from Sarah, we're gonna have to incorporate those results into the report as well.
Well,
Right.
why can't we meet on the 11th to talk about the survey?
Because Sarah's not
Or
available.
I'm sorry, not the 11th, I'm sorry, the 4th. Meet on the 4th as we already have scheduled
They're not
to talk
because-
about the
do the
survey.
presentation, Nancy.
Because it won't be finalized by then. And
No.
as I mentioned, Sarah is going to be away.
Oh,
So can we just, like Laura just mentioned, scheduling the next meeting for the 18th. Sarah will do her presentation, and instead of going an hour and a half, we do 2 hours.
I think that's a good idea.
yeah, sure.
That's doable.
And like I say, all of you are going to have the guts of it. And
I sent it
there's
to them,
nothing I
Mike.
found in it that was inconsistent with the general themes we've been hearing
Yeah.
directly in our meetings. So there's no surprises in there.
Mike, the draft was just sent to all the members.
Okay.
Okay, that will work very well. And we will have something substantive for people to react to. But if you have anything that you want in it, if the document that Nancy and was Paul in on that too?
Yeah, Kim and Paul and I it's what we already had, and we just added one small piece to it.
Well, we're not reinventing the wheel. I have actually lifted statements from that were written before. We're trying to just
Well, that's what this is. It's what's already been written, and we're just adding a definition. That's all it is.
Well, some of the other stuff has taken a lot of footwork. So next time I negotiate my contract, I'm going to include the paper I'm using, so things like that. So I guess, is there anything else? Because I think it's 3 o'clock.
Good.
And we will have this to you in good time so that you will be able to react to it and make some statements. And hopefully we'll be able to shape this up. Is there anything else we need to discuss?
See you later.
Out here.
Okay.
Okay, goodbye.
Where are you, Lori? I want to talk to you. You home? No.